Good morning and welcome to this RICS World Built Environment Forum COP26 mini webinar series. We're delivering this webinar to you today in partnership with our lead tech partner, ASITE. Thank you to ASITE for their support. My name is John Ramshaw. I'm the manager of the World Built Environment Forum. I'm also rather nervous as I've been drafted in at very short notice to moderate this panel due to some technical issues with our planned moderator. Apologies for anyone who was expecting to hear the dulcet northern tones of Barry Cullen. Barry unfortunately has been unable to log in this morning, so I'm stepping into his sizable shoes. Thankfully, I'm joined by three brilliant panelists this morning. Jonathan Flower, who's a research fellow at the Centre for Transport and Society at UWE Bristol. Anna Keeley, who is a project director and architect at McBain's. And David McKenna, a landscape architect with Street Spirit Design. Hello, Jonathan, Anna, and David. Great to have you with us.
Hello.
Hi.
Okay, without further ado, let's dive into the questions that we have. We have registrations from over 20 countries today, so a truly international audience. To our audience, if you have any questions that you would like complementary to the questions that we have planned, please do submit them through the question and answer function on GoToWebinar, and we will do our best to get to them. But our first programmed question, and I will point this one at David McKenna. David, bit of a big one to start with. How inclusive are our streets?
Well, yeah, they're not inclusive. They're dominated by traffic, and I think one of the big problems is that drivers feel like they have a bit of a divine right to road space, and they feel little sort of responsibility for the safety of pedestrians and cyclists. So I think what we need to do is we need to be changing driver behaviour and creating an empathy for people who are their sort of potential victims, really. And that sort of empathy is the way, and responsibility, and making them understand their responsibility is a way to make our streets more inclusive. Drivers need to be made aware that they're bringing a lethal weapon into a sort of crowded urban environment and behave accordingly. And this sort of the way this, I think, can be achieved is really through perhaps a public awareness campaign, but also legislation has been talked about, making the driver responsible for any collisions with a pedestrian or cyclist. But locally, it's about designing the physical environment, again, to create that greater sense of responsibility. And you do that by creating more of a pedestrian priority character to a place, and through that you change driver behaviour.
Thank you, David. Yeah, so I think what we're talking about here is a problem that the streets are still designed for road users, automobiles. Is that's the problem in a nutshell, isn't it?
Yes, yeah, that's right. Our streets are designed by transport planners and highway engineers primarily, and just you can tell in the name their priority is going to be moving vehicles through these spaces rather than on the other functions of a street or on the sort of movement of pedestrians and cyclists.
Mm-hmm. And we had a high-profile incident at COP earlier this week when there was no wheelchair access for a high-ranking member of, I think, the Israeli government delegation. It seemed an incredible oversight, really, that such a large event could have missed that out. But I mean, this is symptomatic of a larger problem, is it not, David, in terms of accessibility?
Yes, I mean, I think it's this empathy thing, but also that empathy of a designer, whether they're highways designers or landscape architects, etc. The inclusive design tends to be an afterthought, and it's really because they don't care enough, I think, about the people. And I think so. I think getting that sort of caring mentality into the design profession, rather than we'll put a bit of tactile paving in here or a drop curb there as an afterthought. There's certainly the most recent British standard 8300 is really helpful, and is pushing that discussion and debate along.
Great, thank you. I wonder if I could bring Anna in here, Anna, as an architect, whether there are some, I guess, quick wins to resolve these sorts of problems, anything that we should just be kind of baking into urban planning from the outset. Oh, Anna, I think you may still be on mute.
Can you hear me now?
We can hear you now.
Oh, good. Technical issues as always. So no, I think David is absolutely right. And I think we do need to improve the pedestrian experience on our streets and move towards more active modes of transportation in our towns and cities generally. I think, you know, quick wins, the obstructions and the littering of street furniture generally, the choice of surface treatments, color contrasts, whether it's, you know, the steps, the ramps, the railings, the seating, I think they all need to be reviewed against a much wider range of accessibility and mobility considerations. And I think to do this, we must be engaging with local organisations, you know, regional or national charities, whether it's access groups, as well as dedicated testing methodologies to understand what does work and what doesn't work for different groups. I think we need to be working hard in partnership with developers and the local authorities generally to avoid building barriers into new developments. We do need to recognise that accessible environments are confidence building. They do promote independence for people and promote physical activity.
That's great, thank you. I love that accessible environments are confidence building. I think that's such a great way of just encapsulating it. If we move on to our next question, I'll bring Jonathan into the discussion here. We have touched upon it just there, Jonathan, but we're being encouraged to walk and cycle more. Certainly there was a lot of anecdotal evidence at the least that during the COVID lockdown in the Western world, there was a great many more people cycling and walking. I guess the question is, how can the streets be made more inviting and safer for pedestrians and cyclists, and how can we make sure that we consolidate any gains that were made in this respect during the COVID-19 crisis?
Yeah, thank you. I could say a lot here, but I want to point out 6 different things. One is separation, another is lower speeds, thirdly would be designed with people who are walking, cycling and rolling. By rolling, I mean using wheelchairs or mobility scooters in mind, making sure our streets are less intimidating, both in design and also in the behavior of other users on the streets. Make sure that regulations are looking out for people who are walking and cycling, thinking here of speed and parking and side road crossings, and finally making walking and cycling aspirational. So just picking up on separation, I recently undertook a study in Bristol, exploring with participants what makes streets more conducive to walking and cycling. And the number one issue that came up was separation. So separation between curb or verge separation between cyclists and pedestrians between pedestrians and motorized vehicles. In terms of at lower speeds, I think most people on the call today would, whether they're drivers or bus users, would dream of speeds of 15 miles an hour or 25 kilometers an hour at peak times in most cities. So why do we insist on much higher urban limits? It's obviously safer when there's more parity between driver speeds and rider speeds. It's easier for pedestrians to cross streets when the default speed is lower. And the perception of all users of the streets is greatly increased as the speed limits decrease. In terms of intimidation, if streets feel intimidating to people on foot and cycle, they're going to do something else. They're going to either drive or stay at home. In terms of regulation, low speeds, I would say 20 miles an hour or 30 kilometers an hour should be the default speed in proximity of pedestrians and cyclists. And then things like regulation around pavement parking for pedestrians and in terms of cyclists ensuring in design there's adequate space to open a park door without impinging on cycle routes. And I mentioned aspiration. If we look around the world, there are cities where there are very high modal shares for walking and cycling. So in East Africa, for example, Addis Ababa in Ethiopia, Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, or Nairobi in Kenya, and over in West Africa, Lagos in Nigeria. All of those cities have modal share for walking and cycling far in excess of 40%, and yet often people are walking and cycling in those cities because they have no choice. And in order to retain those high levels of walking and cycling and even improve on them, we need to ensure that walking and cycling is aspirational and it's safe, so that we can build on what exists. And then you mentioned COVID. Also in that study I mentioned earlier, it was interesting that some of the participants were saying that COVID streets were the first time in their lifetime, in many cases, that they experienced streets that weren't car dominated for more than a weekend or a bank holiday. Some of the people said that they hadn't previously walked or cycled on their local streets or let their children play on their local streets, and they were able to do that, felt comfortable and safe to do that for the first time. And of course, things are changing now. Cars are returning, but I think some changes, and I would say mostly for the better, have stayed. People have tasted what it's like to have streets that are less car dominated. So I can still see cafes and restaurants taking some of the carriageway space, some streets that are now only open to walking and cycling and closed to through motorized traffic. Cities like Paris and Bogota in Colombia that have opened many kilometers of new cycleways, and some narrow footways that have been widened.
Thank you, Jonathan. And I guess I'll open to the panel, perhaps to David here, and just ask, do you share Jonathan's optimism here that some of the gains made during the COVID-19 crisis are gains that we can hold on to, or are we going to be looking back at this as a halcyon moment in 5 years from now?
Well, I certainly agree with Jonathan on speed. Speed is the absolute thing that we need to control vehicle speed in towns, and we can all sort of discuss different design options, but it's the sort of the physical, like the laws of physics really, that determine that speed, if you can control speed, you reduce accidents, you reduce the severity of accidents, and it makes it a much more pleasant and civil environment for people, whatever mode of transport or however they get around. 20 mile an hour is certainly something we should be aiming for across urban environments, but it needs to be more refined than that as well. I think what we really need to concentrate on is junctions, and controlling speed at junctions down to 10 mile an hour really, because most accidents happen at junctions, and as a designer they're the hardest thing to design, because you've got all the different turning movements, crossing movements, often in a restricted space. You can't segregate everything, every single movement everywhere. You can if you have space, but our historic environments, you don't have that space. So we need to really focus on junctions and controlling vehicle speed into junctions, and getting it down to sort of 10 mile an hour. And I think, again, our highways and transport teams think 20 mile an hour is slow, but actually as a pedestrian, a bus traveling at 20 mile an hour, 2 or 3 meters from you is quite scary. So we need to get those speeds even lower.
That's great, thank you. That's fascinating. So 20 miles an hour across the urban realm, but even slower at those kind of pinch points, junctions and what have you. Great, thank you. Just a reminder to our listeners that we are inviting your questions today. Please do send them through. We'll do our very best to get to them during the hour. If we can't, we'll certainly put them to our panelists and ask them for some written responses that we will then publish later in the month. We'll jump on for now to the third scheduled question. This one is going out to you, Anna, in the first instance. And we're moving slightly away from safety, road safety, and more into kind of general personal safety, is it possible to design crime out of the built environment?
Yeah, so I think as a starting point, I think it's important that we all remember that crime is such a complex social issue, and it starts far before the actual moment when a crime is committed. I think we must all recognise that there are limitations on design as a means to solving the issues. There have been a couple of positive steps in recent times. Earlier this month, the third round of funding for the Safer Streets Fund was announced, with police forces and local authorities to receive a share of £23 million to make public spaces safer for all. That was with a particular focus on potential concern to women and girls. So since its inception, the government has committed £70 million to the Safer Streets Fund to support local areas across England and Wales, introducing initiatives at stopping offences from happening in the first place. The round 2 of the fund saw 50 projects awarded just shy of £20 million to go towards measures to cut crime, including changes to the design of streets, such as lock gates on alleyways, increased street lighting, and the installation of CCTV. To me, this does raise the question of, is this really going to solve the issue? I think the urbanist Jane Jacobs' work from the 1960s is still as relevant now as it was then. Eyes on the street is the best form of security. As she so aptly put it back then, there are horrifying public crimes which can and do occur in well-lit subway stations when no effective eyes are present, yet they virtually never occur in darkened theatres where many people and many eyes are present. I think we should be concentrating our efforts on creating inclusive spaces that people want to visit and that they want to dwell, on the logic that the more people we get into a space, the safer the space. I think we must try to activate our streets and public places to benefit from ideas of natural surveillance, the maximising of visibility, and the fostering of positive social interactions on that basis. I think we could probably do more to further explore the programming of spaces. There's potential to close down some pathways at night to reroute crowds to a handful of more arterial routes to densify and populate. On top of this, we need to be encouraging people and communities to act as custodians of their local surroundings. I think we must all have a responsibility as to our neighbours and people in the street. There's one positive initiative on the back of the Safer Streets funding that was announced in September this year, that the Home Office and National Police Chiefs Council have launched Street Safe. So this is an online mapping tool which allows members of the public to flag areas where they don't feel safe and say why. So it's a pilot service for anyone to anonymously tell police about public places where they do feel unsafe because of environmental issues. For example, street lighting, which isn't working, abandoned buildings, or vandalism, all because of antisocial behaviours that they've experienced. This data is aimed to be kept as part of the government's agenda to tackle violence against primarily women and girls, but not exclusively. What happens next with this pilot scheme and its data, I believe, is still to be determined, but you would hope that this can be used to inform future urban planning in a much more inclusive way. I think it was back in 2013, there was a similar app developed in India called Safety Pin that aimed to help women stay safe by letting users rate the streets and areas for safety criteria such as lighting, visibility, people density, gender diversity, security and transportation. I think by aggregating safety data like this for use by local governments and planners, we stand a far better chance of being able to design out crime and design out the environmental issues that influence those crimes, and all creating more inclusive spaces that are well populated and are safe to use.
Thank you, Anna. And can you just tell us again that the Safe Streets Initiative, where can people who are interested find that online?
Yeah, so it's
sorry, I've put you on the spot now. We
no,
can find out.
You have, yeah, absolutely. Maybe I'll just do a bit of research on how to access that, and we can share that afterwards. Great,
that'd be great. We will add that to our Twitter feed, and we'll do a bit of research to find if there are similar initiatives globally as well, because we know this isn't a program that's problem that's confined to the UK. Jonathan, if I can just bring you in, one particular issue with safety, particularly at night, is public transport stops, bus stops, stations, that kind of thing. Is there anything that can be done to make those places feel safer?
I don't think it's anything different to some of the things that Anna's been mentioning. If it's a station, they tend to be well lit. Bus stops, not so much. So lighting plays a part. But the same things with eyes on the streets. There has to be people there. So increasing the footfall, the number of people there. And those people can be walking, they can be living, they can be cycling, they can be other people using the public transport, and even going back to speed. If people are driving slowly, that is much better than people that are speeding by and have no perception of what's happening around. So people and lighting. And as well, involve a diversity of people, I think, in the designing, people who are familiar with using public transport, involved in the designs. I mean, going a bit wider than bus stops and bus stations, I've been impressed by where there's a much greater diversity in designers, administrators and commissioners of transport. Things tend to be done better and safer, particularly where more women have been involved, for example. So female designers, mayors, commissioners help. For example, Anne Hidalgo, the Mayor of Paris, Janet Sadiq Khan, the ex-transplantation commissioner in New York, and the many women that were involved in designing the Barcelona superblocks. I think diversity in the people involved certainly helps improve safety as well.
That's great, thank you. We'll move on to the next question, and just again a reminder to our audience, please do submit your own. Those members of our audience who are regular or highly engaged with World Built Environment Forum will know that our global summit is coming around in January of next year in Dubai. We're going to be focusing on urban livability, and in all the work that we've done in the programming of that summit, one thing that's come up time and time again is that livability is linked to a sense of pride in place, belonging in place. So if I can ask you, David, how can good urban design create a positive sense of place for the people who live and work there?
Well, I was sort of breaking the idea of a sense of place in the public realm into three key elements. One is the built infrastructure surrounding the public realm. Second is the sort of historic functions of that space, what's happened there in the past and how it's been used. And the third is the sort of future functions of that space, how we want it to be used and how we're going to create that history that is, well, what will be our history in the future. And traditional highway infrastructure really creates a poor setting for our sort of built environment. And we quite often have a really strong urban environment with good quality buildings that the signage and lining and busy traffic areas really detract from. It was sort of brought home to me a bit. I used to work for RBI Group, who are a Canadian-owned company, and I was a bit apologetic when I was sort of taking one of the Canadian directors around a project in one of the tired northern towns, where he was used to building skyscrapers and very sort of flashy developments, and we were doing a market square in this town, but he was really wowed by the sort of the market hall and the town hall, and a lot of the other Victorian buildings that we kind of take for granted, but actually have huge value if you can just put them in the right setting. And a lot of my schemes are all about generating a very simple foreground to allow our sort of historic buildings to really create value in a town. So that's the built infrastructure element. And so we need to tell people about the sort of historic functions of the place. And I think I'm always a bit nervous of the word pride that you use there in a place. But you do want to make people understand that where they come from, they can still achieve great things. So, for instance, a project I did in Accrington recently, we told the sort of very, very rich history of Accrington, particularly around the sort of Industrial Revolution. It literally sort of changed the world, some of the things that were invented there. And it wasn't to generate a sense of pride, but it was just to sort of say to people, well, look, these people from Accrington, they've achieved all these things. There is things that can happen. People from this town can really sort of make the world a better place. So yeah, generating, and that really sort of worked very well in people accepting this new square we built in the town, and it meant that it was sort of really adopted by the town. And so the sort of third element I was saying is that the sort of future functions. So that in Accrington, the local authority, I think they set up something like 52 events in the square over the first year, and it's designing a space that can accommodate all those functions. And event programming is really crucial to generating a sense of place. It's not just about the built environment, it's about the memories that you generate in a place. And an event that can last half a day, the memories can last for years and years, like 50 years. So I think we don't put enough budget and resources into events programming. And so yeah, and I would also just lastly mention junctions again. Junctions were traditional meeting points, places that trade happened, social places. But nowadays they're just designed to maximise traffic flow, really. So I think we need to really, all our junctions, we need to really take a look at and sort of say, well, can this be a social space? Can this be a place for trade as well as accommodating sort of movement?
And if I can perhaps bring Anna in here. Anna, is there any way that you can design for well-being, personal health, wellness, in that kind of same realm of creating a sense of place? Can you create a sense of well-being in a place?
Yeah, I absolutely think you can. I think the point that David made, that it has to respond to and it has to reinforce locality, I think is really important. With that, it has to celebrate the character, the history of the space, the people. It's probably worth noting that there is no one size that fits all, and what works for one area of a city is not necessarily going to work for another. But I think it's the connectivity and the permeability and having a diverse offering, the choice, the variety, and the users. It has to be resilient and it has to be flexible. But it's those sort of quality spaces that are vibrant, lively, and a joy to use that really do instill a sense of well-being and amenity.
That's great, thank you. I'll stay with you for the next question here, Anna. And this may be putting you on the spot, but are you able to cite some real-world examples of good urban design driving that sense of inclusivity, well-being? I know David is wary of the term, but a sense of local pride or belonging.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there's a couple which spring to mind, and it builds on the idea that David just mentioned, really, of the programming of spaces. So one that I particularly engage with on a regular basis as a resident is the Elephant Park development in Southwark in London. So that's a project between Lend-Lease and the Southwark Council, and it's completely revitalised the Zone 1 area of Elephant and Castle. It took a former deteriorated neighbourhood and it has turned it into a vibrant, a well-designed, very high density destination, but it has a mix of multi-tenured homes, commercial units, community facilities, and a range of public spaces, and it's all focused around a 2-acre green park. So the success, in my opinion, of this scheme does lie in the diverse and well-programmed inclusive spaces. And I think that has to be a testament to a design-led and participative approach from the project teams, the local authorities, and the existing communities. It shows a clear understanding for the history of the area, the diversity of the local communities, and the importance for a flexible and robust solution that is well loved and well used for years to come. So the scheme has a variety of size of units to facilitate business startups. It has small independent vendors. It has larger units for gyms and yoga studios, libraries, bars, and restaurants, which all help to accommodate a much more inclusive approach, providing for the range of needs and different demographics. I think it's also worth noting that, you know, this range of uses does activate a space from morning through till night, which is a massive positive. The buildings themselves within the development all have active street frontages, again reinforcing the idea of you know, natural passive surveillance, as well as benefiting from the proximity to the green space and the impact that we all know that has on mental and physical health and well-being. I think that, you know, that there's little things in terms of excellent design within the space. There's clear legibility, there's accessible and identifiable routes, there's good public transport connections, safe and clean access to public toilets, there's attractive and well-designed street furniture, and it incorporates clever lighting to enhance the experience rather than simply acting as a floodlight to the space. And I guess from speaking from personal experience of frequently walking through the space, you know, at night, it does feel safe and it does feel secure. It's probably worth noting that projects of that size and master planning at that scale, it's not a quick process, and it probably has been years and decades in the making. It requires hard investment, and I think the phasing of those types of developments are absolutely key to the integration into the wider communities and the existing fabric. So, you know, the temporary states of those developments as well as the final completion. One of the positives, I think, from being in the Elephant Park area is that they have provided temporary facilities. They term these meanwhile parks and community spaces, and they've been there throughout the build as a way to promote events, collaboration, communication, and it all helps to build better links and better trust with the local surroundings and the community. I think there's some other really good examples looking potentially further afield, and they all build on the idea of locality and community ties, particularly in a post-pandemic reassessment as well. So, you know, during the lockdowns, people were confined to a certain radius from their houses. There's ideas, Paris, for example, have been championing the concept of the 15-minute city, or a city of proximities, as some have termed it. And that's really with a desire to focus on the neighbourhood, amenity and core services which are easy to walk to or cycle to. Melbourne has a strategic plan for a 20-minute neighbourhood. Jonathan mentioned it earlier, but the Barcelona superblock idea, that takes 9 city blocks into a neighbourhood where traffic is then restricted to an arterial route around the perimeter. So that frees up all of the internal roads for public space and social interaction. The C40 City Coalition, which is obviously focused on fighting climate change, that they're actually endorsing these and identifying that neighbourhood action is absolutely critical to meeting net zero targets and provide cities where everyone can thrive. There's also further examples. For example, in Sweden, they are taking it further with a hyperlocal approach of a single street level community, a 1-minute city, as they're terming it. That's called, that initiative's called Street Moves. That allows residents to become almost co-architects of their street. They're using consultations and workshops. Residents can decide how much of their street they wish to give to parking, how much they wish to give to children's play space, seating, planting, cycle stands. Some of their earlier test sites, they've used like a modular timber system. It's almost Lego-like. They've, you know, drawn parallels with the whole IKEA sort of hack idea. So they've got a system which is sized to suit a standard parking bay, and then streets have an opportunity to decide on what those connectable amenities are depending on what that local neighbourhood's needs are. So I think these smaller interventions, you know, they're so interesting and they're so much easier to start, and they help to promote the conversations, they engage with communities, and they really help to develop social interactions to deliver spaces that do meet the needs of everyone.
Great, thank you. I've been suffering from some connection issues during the last 5 minutes. I'm not sure if that's confined to me or if it's a broader problem, but if so, just apologies to our listeners who may have experienced any disruption. I wouldn't be so unkind, Anna, as to ask you to name names, but you must have seen examples where it hasn't gone well, where it's almost had the kind of the opposite effect. Urban design has had the opposite to the desired effects, and I just wondered if there are any common characteristics of when it goes wrong, why it goes wrong, that you could name.
Yeah, well, I think it's what David and Jonathan were both mentioning earlier. It's where I think we are still placing a too high a dominance on motor vehicles, and we're not having a human-centered, human-scale approach. I really do think that we, you know, for developments and for for these interventions to work, we absolutely do need to be putting a human-centered approach into it. It should be all about more active, you know, pedestrian-focused, cyclist-focused modes of transport. And that's without naming any particularly bad developments.
Yeah, no, thank you. So it's kind of coming through loud and clear, certainly from the first half an hour or so of this webinar, that at least part of the problem, if not a large part of the problem, is cars and our continued reliance on the automobile. So if I can turn to Jonathan with quite a blunt, simple question: are pedestrianised shopping centres, city centres, town centres, are they a good idea?
Well, I would say that generally it's only people who walk that enter shops, and so people on foot are certainly good for business, unless it's a ram raid, in which you might get a car entering the shop, but that's not positive. But I think if we go back to some of the early examples of pedestrianised shopping centres in the UK, a lot of them came out following Colin Buchanan's Traffic in Towns report back in the 1960s, and they were designed for people to drive there, which is not generally good for towns. They can have challenges like severance for cyclists, or conflict between cyclists and pedestrians if they're not well designed. And certainly we should always be considering their relationship with public transport, and that should always be carefully considered. So I don't.
Thank you. Yeah, no, thank you, Jonathan. Are there any links to safety, crime, and pedestrianisation, one way or another? Yes,
certainly. I think some of the things that Anna was saying to us earlier, if we're just talking about 9 to 5 shopping streets, they're rarely the best solution. We need to create, as Anna was quoting Jane Jacobs, eyes on the streets, by designing a mixture of businesses, so not just shops but also hospitality, accommodation, entertainment, and residential, those mixed uses, to extend the time of day when there are eyes of the streets, can certainly help safety issues. If we're just talking about a 9 to 5 shopping area, then there are certainly risks in terms of crime. I think really what we need to be doing is reimagining this idea of pedestrianised shopping areas, and thinking more about walking and cycling dominated areas rather than necessarily pedestrian only areas.
Thank you. And David, if I can turn to you, pedestrianisation doesn't take, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me pedestrianisation doesn't take cars off the road, it just funnels them onto different roads. Is there any problem with increased congestion as a result of pedestrianisation, and is there any remedy to that, if so?
I think in terms of congestion, the sort of numbers of vehicles that you get going down at a street that you might consider pedestrianised tend to be very, very low in traffic movement terms. So by moving them to another street, they can easily be accommodated. So, I mean, the sort of if you were thinking about pedestrianising a street, it might, in its existing form, say, have 100 vehicles an hour going down it, or something of that order, maybe 300 vehicles an hour. But those sorts of flows could easily be accommodated if you would design into a street that was more designed for traffic movement. I mean, you do need, I know certainly in Lancaster they've been looking at some low traffic neighbourhoods, and they do have a problem in that there aren't the bigger streets to move traffic to. So I think, for instance, the Ghent example, which is often used, does have a ring road which you put all the traffic on, and a lot of our towns don't have that. And the sort of we have a lot of gyratory systems that perhaps are more integrated into the urban environment rather than a segregated ring road. So yeah, so it can be a problem in some areas. I think less so perhaps right in the town centre, but perhaps more so in these low traffic neighbourhoods. You might find that you do have to put the traffic somewhere. Certainly for now, and until longer term, you might be able to decrease it. But it's all about getting the balance right, and it's a different solution for different places. So where you have high enough pedestrian numbers sufficient to animate a street, then pedestrianisation is probably the right way to go. But you might then allow traffic at different times of the day, and I think the sort of diurnal flows are really important to consider. Too often we design for peak flow traffics, and we really actually need to be considering more the flow that happens most of the time, and the flow pedestrians experience most of the time. Because if we just design for peak flow, which is the default method, then when flows are a bit lower, you end up with higher speeds, because you've created enough space for vehicles to travel at these higher speeds. And often you find that peak flows only happen twice a day for an hour, whereas the flows experienced by pedestrians in a shopping street happen for 8 hours in the day. And so if you've enabled faster speeds by accommodating those peak flows, then you're impacting pedestrians for that 8 hour period when there might be quite high pedestrian densities. So yeah, there's sort of diurnal considerations as well. And then lastly, I think Jonathan mentioned public transport, getting bus, in particular bus penetration, but also taxi penetration into towns means, especially in our sort of historic urban grids, that you have to take some traffic down streets that you might otherwise want to pedestrianise, and you have to accommodate that. And often in our sort of historic urban environments, that does mean more of a sharing of a space than segregating, because we just don't have enough space to segregate every form, cyclists, pedestrians, vehicles, in perhaps an 8 metre wide building to building street.
That's great.
So yeah, so basically it's about the right solution for the right place. It's not there isn't one answer for this.
Yeah, so it's as was said earlier, one size fits all approaches rarely work, I guess.
Yes, and I think actually sort of our highways design guidance generally assumes one size does fit all, and is built for uniformity. Our highway system is built for uniformity, whereas our streets aren't uniform.
Great, thank you. Anna, this one's for you. It's again quite a broad one. I guess the question says, how can stakeholders work together to ensure that our streets meet the needs of everyone? I guess we could extend that out by saying, who are the stakeholders that we need to be engaging in that as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think recognizing what that stakeholder group is early on is absolutely key. So that's probably going to look like local authorities, developers, designers, policymakers. But I think it absolutely must, from the outset, put occupiers and everyday users as a much higher priority. And that needs to focus on as wide a group as possible, and probably include those more marginalized and vulnerable groups to make sure everyone is well represented. I think we probably need to recognize that is likely to require different approaches in terms of communication techniques, the engagement activities or events that we need to be looking at to ensure inclusivity, removing as many barriers as possible to ensure attendance and participation is comfortable for all, to get the most out of those initial sessions. I think we probably need to look at the social dimension as well. We've talked a little bit earlier about human behaviours. What would projects look like if we had behavioural specialists as part of those early stakeholder groups, applying what is known from human sciences? We're so good with technology nowadays that we have opportunities through the way we work, the way we model virtual reality, that we can take those theory and observations of human behaviours and we can test those with simulations to find solutions and strategies that do work, and they do have positive results, reflecting on that sort of stakeholder group and actually engaging with the everyday users. I think other technology that is probably worth mentioning, obviously we touched on it earlier, is that street safe pilot. So actually using that data and ensuring that data collection should be shared with local authorities and planners and with those initial sort of research groups in order to inform the decision-making process. I think that will allow solutions to tackle the issues highlighted by the public. I also think it was Jonathan who mentioned it earlier, but I think probably a final point that I think we all need to work harder on to address is ensuring that the workforce responsible for designing our streets and cities is as diverse and representative as the streets we're trying to create. There was a 2018 Design Council survey that showed that 78% of the UK design workforce was male, and that's with comparison to the wider UK workforce, which was 53% male. That's also in spite of women making up to 63% of all students studying creative arts and design courses at university. So how on earth can we expect our streets and our buildings to be inclusive and accessible and meet the needs of everyone if our workforce doesn't? This really must be a key issue for the professions responsible as we move forward to ensure our streets are truly designed to meet the needs of everyone.
That's so interesting. I guess a male-heavy workforce is going to design kind of male-centric spaces.
Absolutely. I think, you know, we all experience our towns and cities differently, and we all have a tendency to, you know, put personal experiences and personal opinions onto the work that we do. So in order to get, you know, a diverse and inclusive response, then we need the workforce to be well represented.
That's great, thank you. It's a shame actually Barry Cullen couldn't join us today. Barry's our diversity and inclusion analyst and is doing some great work certainly in the surveying profession on exactly that, to try and remedy that imbalance, and not only the gender imbalance but also imbalances in ethnicity and other identifying characteristics as well. So vital stuff. You mentioned earlier, Anna, that these kind of big urban planning schemes they take a long time to come to fruition, and they take a lot of money to realise as well. I guess the question is to what extent is cost an inhibiting factor, and what is the best kind of pushback against those cost-based concerns that I guess we're all too familiar with?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the fact of, you know, a product of the world we live in, isn't it, that they all require sort of hard investment to see real change. And I think it's important that, you know, the developers and the people funding these projects, they do have a vested long-term interest in these schemes. You know, I think so often, you know, looking from our perspective, from an architecture perspective, when you're looking at individual buildings per se, you will have someone come in, design, develop a building, and then probably exit and hand it over, and you don't really have an opportunity to test those facilities. Do they work? Are they fit for purpose? And this is maybe where local authorities and, you know, we need to be looking at different models. The build to rent model, for example. So I think it was David mentioned it earlier, but the programming of those spaces, if a long-term build to rent developer and investor is invested in ensuring that a place is successful, then maybe they're more willing to you know, stump up in the first place. They want the long-term success of these places rather than a quick win to finish the building and exit the scheme and exit the area.
And we certainly know from the work that we've done with the Global Infrastructure Hub that this is quite specific, but investment in infrastructure has a economic multiplier effect of around about 150%. And I'm sure the same is true on good urban design, that these projects, when they're done well, more than pay for themselves over time. We'll move on to the final question. I'm going to aim this one at David first, but please, to our other two panelists, please do think of your own answers, because I will be coming to you once David is done. David, if you could give one piece of advice that would make our streets more inclusive, would make them safer, would make them just better places to be, and I don't want to second guess your answer, but I feel like I might know where you'll be going with this one. But what would that piece of advice be?
Well, I'm going to sort of take a liberty and just give two pieces of advice very quickly. The first one is reducing traffic speeds. We've mentioned many times already today. But the second one is to take design and management responsibility of our streets away from transport planners and highway engineers, because those departments naturally prioritise movement over other functions, and in particular vehicular movement over other functions. And so I'd like to give that responsibility to urban designers and landscape architects who I think have a more balanced view of the world. And I think this is a particular problem in two-tier authorities where the transport planning group is in the county, perhaps, and the district or town or local councils have responsibility for economic or social viability of a town, whereas the county transport planners have no responsibility or motivation to encourage those functions. So yeah, I think it's that responsibility for streets and the sort of urban network, moving that away from movement centric departments and professions.
Great, thank you. So lowering speeds and shifting responsibility. They're David's prescriptions. Anna, can I come to you?
Yeah, so I mean, I completely agree with David about taking it away from maybe transport planners and putting it into general urban planners and landscape teams. I think there does need to be a focus on local needs. It needs to be community driven, and it needs to be human centered in order to develop those strategies for sort of more long-term, resilient and flexible urban solutions.
Great, thank you. So addressing local needs and engaging communities. And Jonathan, final word goes to you.
That's a bit of a different spin. I would mention the magic 7%. There was a paper earlier in the year by Gould et al. Which showed that when 7% mode share is for cycling or above in any city or town, then at least 50% of all cyclists will be women. There will be better representation of children and older people cycling, as opposed to when you drop below that figure, then you get a predomination of men, younger adult men, and journey to work trips. And of course, to create that kind of cycling environment where people feel safe to cycle and have it as an option, then you need to create good, well-designed cycle streets, usually with separation from pedestrians and separation from motorized traffic. So do everything possible to achieve 7% or more mode share for cycling, and because only when that environment and street culture feels safe and comfortable enough for everyone to consider cycling as an option does that happen. And of course, cycling streets are also good as walking streets, so it works for both people walking and cycling.
That's great, thank you, Jonathan. So 7 is the magic number if you want to get more people cycling or a better spread of people cycling in your town or city. You need a 7% mode share for cycling. Really interesting. That brings us to the end of the webinar. I can only thank all of our panelists for their contributions. It was a fascinating hour. Thank you so much. Just a reminder here that we'll publish a recording and a written summary of this webinar over the course of the next couple of weeks, and we'll make sure that we signpost that through our social media. When we do, please do feel free to share it with your professional networks. There'll also be an online poll which will appear on your screens at the end of this webinar. Your feedback is absolutely vital to us. We can only get better at this by listening to you telling us what we need to do. So please do take the time. It will only take 30 seconds, but it's highly valuable for us. This has been the second in our 5-part mini series. The next COP26 webinar will be on the 9th of November. The topic will be Beyond Net Zero 2050, fossil fuel free by 2050. So that's about extending out this this net zero argument to be even more ambitious. It's going to be a fascinating hour again. Please do join us. And if I can just at this point interject with a bit of shameless self-promotion for WBEF. You may have seen that back in August we released our first annual sustainability report, really well received by the market. We have today just released an addendum to that report to coincide obviously with COP26. You can find that by going to our website rics.org/WBEF and then look for the reports and research link on the homepage. That will take you through to all of our research. There you'll be able to find the addendum. There's some fascinating additional findings there. Thanks once again to A-Sites, World Built Environment Forum's lead tech partner. We couldn't do this without them. We're as ever grateful to them for their support. We have an essay competition for young talent. If you don't fall into the age bracket of 18 to 35, firstly I share your pain, but if you do know some very talented people in that age bracket, please do ask them to check this essay competition out. Our Future, Our Planet. We're looking for great ideas on how we can how the surveying profession can play an active role in solving some of the big existential problems that face all of us in these climate emergency days. I mentioned it earlier, our global summit takes place in Dubai in January. The focus of that will be the livable city, agile, healthy and resilient. And there will be more details about how you can access that content shortly. You're welcome to attend in person or to log in digitally. You can follow us on social media, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn. You can see along the bottom of that slide just there our handles. Please do come and engage with us if you hadn't already. And also, why not download the World Built Environment Forum app and you know, carry us with you in your pocket everywhere you go. If that sounds like a desirable thing, I don't know, I'll leave that to you to decide. That's enough from me. I think I've whittled on for long enough. I'm going to go and find Barry Cullen and personally fix his Wi-Fi, because I never want to find myself in this situation at short notice again. Thank you all for your time, really appreciate it, and we'll see you again hopefully on the 9th of November.